I want to welcome you to Be the Solution, Interrogating Structural Racism. Before we get underway, a friendly reminder that the U.S. midterm elections take place today, and after our panel, you'll still have ample time to go out and vote. As I understand it, there's a polling station for some of you, namely students at the University of Maryland registered in College Park, in this very building. So there's time. As we discuss structural racism today, let's keep in mind the current political climate in our nation, in our state, and on our campus. Right? Let's think about how we might intervene by voting and also through other various strategies and techniques of political engagement and social change in pursuit of racial justice. Voting alone is great, but it's insufficient. Hopefully we'll chat about these various strategies and techniques today. My name is Lamar Jarrell Bruce. I am an assistant professor of American Studies here at the University of Maryland, and I will be the moderator for today. I want to thank a few folks and a few units on campus first. Please join me in thanking the organizers and sponsors of the event, the Baha'i Chair for World Peace, along with the Critical Race Initiative in Sociology, the MLAW program, that's Maryland Law Program, and the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences at the University of Maryland College Park, all of whom co-sponsored today's event. I also want to thank Kate Seaman, who is an administrator at the Baha'i Chair Office. I want to thank the students at the Baha'i Chair Office, and I also want to thank the BSOS ambassadors. We have a distinguished panel of scholars who will offer remarks today, and I'm delighted to sit on stage alongside them. But before I introduce them, I want to remind you all that, I want to confirm, has everyone received an index card? No. So you all will be receiving index cards this morning on which you can write any questions, any prompts that arise as you listen to the discussion, the early portion of the discussion. At about 11:30, someone will collect the index cards and we will read those prompts and questions to our panelists, okay? Let's get started with the introductions. To my immediate right is Hoda Mahmoudi. Alongside Dr. Mahmoudi is Dr. Luisa Boyarsky, who is the Assistant Director of Georgetown University's Center for Public and Nonprofit Leadership, and Assistant Research Professor at the McCourt School of Public Policy. To the far right is Dr. Rayshawn Ray, who is an Associate Professor of Sociology and Executive Director of the Lab for Applied Social Science Research here at the University of Maryland College Park. So join me in giving the panelists a round of applause. And let's get this party started. I think I'm going to sit down alongside you all. Again, I'm thrilled to be at the table. So, today's panel, again, is called Be the Solution, Interrogating Structural Racism. I want to solution to structural racism. What comes to mind? What might solutions to structural racism look like, and how might they be realized? Rayshawn?
Okay. So when I think about, first structural racism, I think we really have to try to define that term. And it's a loaded term in the sense that structural racism is really about policies and practices that oftentimes inhibit people from being able to gain equity, independence, and agency in our society. And I think one of the ways, if I use an analogy, one of the ways to think about structural racism is if you take sediment, if you take rock, right? If you take a liquid, so like it's raining outside hard today, and that water is running kind of along rocks and dirt, and over time that dirt starts to cement and starts to get hard. And as that dirt hardens, it becomes more difficult to actually deconstruct it. You actually have to bring in construction and certain types of machinery to actually deconstruct what has actually been built. And so when we talk about structural racism, I think that's a way to talk about it. It's oftentimes covert, it's unseen, but it is nonetheless dangerous in terms of preventing people from doing the sort of things that they want to do. Now, traditionally, we think about overt forms of discrimination and racism, and I think today, given that it's election day, raise your hand if you've already voted. Awesome, look at this, that's wonderful. Raise your hand if you're going to vote when you leave here. Great, thank you. Everyone should definitely exercise their right, because we have to remember that people actually died for our right to have the ability to vote. And we can never forget that. And so people oftentimes dealt with overt forms of racism, whether that be people asking black people how many bubbles bubbled up on a bar of soap in order to be able to vote to pass a particular test, how many plies are on a roll of toilet paper in order to be able to vote. These were the kind of things that they would do after people were prepared to actually take an exam to have the right to vote. And of course, through different types of intimidation. But what we're dealing with today is something different. It's something more seamy in the sense that when we talk about structure, it's dealing with gutting the Voting Rights Act, which allow people the right to vote. But it's not just about that. The Voting Rights Act also protected certain local voting booths and local voting places from actually being removed. And what we've seen over the past decade is that hundreds of polling places have been closed down. So you have Native Americans, for example, who have to take 2 buses and walk potentially a half a mile, taking them an hour to get to vote, where previously their site of voting was right where they were. Some people say that you actually can't use a P.O. box, which of course further marginalizes, say, Native Americans in this regard, who oftentimes might live on a reservation and have a P.O. box instead of a formal address. We also deal with gerrymandering, which is where we see districts being rezoned, and that includes politics as well as education. We can also think about issues as it relates to housing, which deals with redlining and restrictive covenants, and the fact that people go to try and purchase a home and have a particular zip code that they want to purchase in, and all of a sudden their rates are higher. These are the ways that structural racism plays a role in our society that we don't necessarily see that have an impact on what's going on. So what can we do about it? Well, there are students here from the Maryland Law Program, and one of the things that we talk about in class is the difference between distributive versus procedural justice. A lot of people believe in fairness. That's distributive justice. Procedural justice is something different. It's saying that I recognize and acknowledge past wrongs, and because of that, I'm going to institute policies to correct those wrongs to make sure that then we can get to a point where we can actually implement distributive justice to make sure that people are treated fairly. So, and I also think about the difference between equity and equality. Equality is giving people the same thing. Equity is giving people what they need. That becomes something very different. In order to get to a point where we can treat people fairly, we actually have to implement policies that lead to equity. And I think there are certain things that are being done, whether it be, for example, school gardens in Washington, D.C., where they instituted a program. I could talk more about that. Whether it be about policies passed that allow healthcare providers to consult with patients who they perceive to be overweight or obese. That could also be racial equity assessments that businesses and organizations put in place. That could also be dealing with certain types of policies with training and actually focusing on social interactions as it relates to policing. Delegate Jazz Lewis, who is in our county, who actually went to the University of Maryland, is actually implementing a lot of these policies at the state level. So these are the types of policies that are aiming to deal with structural racism, and I think these are the sort of things that we should be focused on.
So much. That is great and completely relevant, obviously, given what today is and the context. So from my perspective, the work that we do at Georgetown University is to focus on how do we make the nonprofit sector a stronger sector, make organizations within the nonprofit sector stronger. And when I think about structural racism, I think about how are we reflecting the changes we want to see in society within our own organizations. The nonprofit sector was designed in an area of power imbalance where primarily white, rich, men and women who started the sector. And primarily a lot of the work the sector is doing is not in those communities. And what does that mean, and how do we better structure our nonprofits to be good at doing the work that we want to do and address some of these structural racism systems within our communities? So the research that I did this past year was to really focus on what are some of the promising practices and positive steps that nonprofits can take in this area. And we found that the first thing is really training. People have to understand, what is this history? What is the history of structural racism? Where did it come from? A lot of nonprofits are still run by white people who just did not go through that experience. And it's very important to understand what that history is. And particularly here in Washington, D.C., this is the center of a lot of where that history started and evolved. And the next piece is really developing common language. How do we define words that we are throwing around up here like we talk about them all the time, but in our organizations on a day-to-day basis, these aren't words that people feel comfortable using. They don't know what they mean. When you hear the word white supremacy, a lot of people just take a step back and don't know how they're really supposed to respond to that. And so having shared definitions within an organization really helps develop a space where people can start to have more difficult conversations, can start to bring some of their lived experiences to the office and say, okay, what does this mean for how we work together, but also the work that we're doing in our communities? And then the next step, which you mentioned really briefly, was doing self-assessments. Every organization needs to get a sense of, well, where are we right now? Where are we starting from? And then start to put together some ideas of, okay, well, where do we want to go? What is our vision for if we were a racially equitable organization? What would that look like? How would we be different than we are today? And start to set some goals and plans to move forward on that. And then the last is, we're starting to see organizations who are really taking this seriously, using words about racial equity in their mission statements, in their value statements, and specifically as goals in their strategic plans. And I'm hearing from organizations, we need to have these clear set goals in our strategic plan because that's where our budget comes from. And that's where we get money, and that's how we can seriously invest in this kind of change that needs to happen within our organizations in order for us to really address it in the community and better improve our programming that we're doing around structural racism.
Well, I don't want to repeat what has already been said, but I think that the whole problem with structural racism or with structures is that really structures in society, if you think about it, government, family, education, economics, whatever, ideally they should be about justice and equity, ideally. I mean, that's why we have them in the first place. And I think it's important to keep that in mind because then when you look around the world, you see, and especially in our country, you see how structures are not promoting those two issues, equity and justice. And I think one of the problems is that sometimes we are blinded to how structures promote racism. Again, it was defined for us beautifully earlier, so I don't want to go into that. But what I'd like to suggest is that to really understand structural racism means that we have to really get into what is it that an institution does that actually prevents certain groups of people from being a part of that institution. What are those barriers? How can we understand those better? Because some of those barriers, some of us understand better than others. Because some of us are not members of the minority group who understands those barriers much better than others. So for me, the issue is how can I, through this program that I run, get anyone, any human being, students, staff, faculty, of course, but the public, anyone who wants to come and engage in discussion, conversation, and would like to learn about these issues, how can we engage them in understanding these more subtle forms of discrimination and I call prejudice? And I'm going to just get a little bit more specific here. I was sitting with Dr. Ray and a couple of other professors at a table in September. And the conversation was just about various things that we do in our work. And the lecture that night was on structural racism. And we got to talking about, implicit bias, issues of prejudice. And what was really important, I wish I had a camera to have captured that moment. Each of these individuals started to talk about their strategy for when a police officer might stop them. They were all African American. So these are 3 different professors at very, very well-established universities. One of them pulled out his wallet and said, the first thing I have is my business card, my card that says I'm a professor at such and such an institution. Behind that is my driver's license. The second one said, and she was in the US military, she said, what I have in the front is my military card, and then my driver's license. And the third one, I think, was a similar concept to the first, that it's the university card followed by the driver's license. Now, I would have never known about this strategy had these 3 individuals not shared that with me. But those individuals who shared that with me, I'm assuming here, and Dr. Ray can of course correct me if I'm wrong, that they felt like we were in a safe space and that we could talk about these things. That it's okay to educate someone like me who may not have been aware of that kind of a problem that these individuals face. I can give you other examples on this campus when Lieutenant Collins was murdered on this campus. The Monday after the incident, there were several of our students who actually were quite afraid to walk on campus. They actually shared this with me, that they were not very easy walking across campus because they were afraid for their lives. You know, that's what I'm talking about in terms of understanding why structural racism is such a barrier to a certain group of people. And I want to just reiterate that in my program, you know, we invite speakers, we have conferences, we have symposia, we put this stuff on YouTube. It reaches all kinds of people around the world. The reason we do that day in and day out, every semester, is because we think education matters. We think knowledge is extremely important, but we like to move knowledge to a level where each of us can become better protagonists of how to be the solution. In other words, how do we ensure that in the environments where we reside, minorities have equal representation with everyone else? And if they don't, how can we remedy that situation? But to really understand the intricacies of structural racism is extremely important and critical.
Thank you for those responses. I want to follow up by asking you all, what are some of the primary social institutions that you believe maintain and uphold structural racism in particular? Dr. Ray?
Yeah, first, Dr. Mahmoudi, thank you for sharing that. That was definitely, it's interesting when you hear stories like that, because oftentimes the number of minorities who are oftentimes in a space is so low that rarely do you get the opportunity to hear the consistency in their stories. And so what Dr. Mahmoudi captured was you have 3 people from very different places in the United States who had never met before. I think maybe I met one of the people before, and who had the same exact story. And really what that story captures are coping mechanisms for dealing with and processing and trying to prevent the fact that we know that we're going to get discriminated against. And what I always think about is, imagine what we could do with that mental processing if we didn't have to worry about that. Imagine how much more could be achieved in spite, and this is one of the things that I always find interesting about history, particularly for African Americans, is that when you look at the fact that about 150 years ago, we were enslaved, and you think about the progress that's been made in that time frame, is astronomical. But that's not the narrative that we have. But anyway, that wasn't the question. The question was about social institutions. I think about structural racism and how it prevents people, as Dr. Mahmoudi said, so structural racism prevents people from even seeing the barriers that exist, and oftentimes make people who were born on third base think they hit a home run. That's what structural racism does. Oftentimes, people who have certain privileges, whether it be about race or gender or cisness. I mean, we could go on and on, ability. Oftentimes we think that we've done something special, when really we were oftentimes handed something. Doesn't mean that people didn't work hard. What it also means is that if other people who didn't have those same opportunities or where you are, that means that they had to overcome some things that you can't even imagine and think about. So when I think about social institutions, I think about two main ones, housing and policing. I'm gonna quickly walk through this. Housing, the reason why housing matters so much is because housing is linked to segregation. Segregation causes education inequality. It then causes inequality in voting opportunities. Today is election day, so that's important. And part of this is thinking about how it happens. Two quick concepts. First, restrictive covenants. Restrictive covenants were put in place to prevent certain people from purchasing property or renting in a particular area. That then means they were relegated to be in another area. That relegation then meant that people could then implement, and people, banks, policymakers, organizations, could then implement what's called redlining, making sure that people can't get access to certain types of loan opportunities, small business opportunities, and then even when they did, jacking the prices up of those resources. This is the reason why you might only see one grocery store or any grocery store in a particular area. This is the reason why when people go to try to purchase a home, they're given an interest rate that's 2 percentage points higher than other people. Over the course of a 30-year loan in this area, that accumulates to about $200,000 or $250,000 in a 30-year loan. That's both of my kids going to college, right there. That's soaked up in money that I couldn't get because I was relegated to live in a black area. So the other thing people have to realize about segregation, neighborhoods are more segregated today than they were in 1980. And because of that, that simultaneously means that our schools are also segregated, which then has an impact on the opportunities we have. And housing is primarily linked to wealth. 50% of the wealth generated in the United States comes from housing. And it's not a mistake then when we could talk about the New Deal and the fact that the GI Bill and Social Security and welfare afforded certain individuals opportunities to get down payments on homes, to go to college, and it restricted the ability for minorities to do the same thing. Policing is important because it transcends success. This story that Dr. Mahmoudi just told was being told by 3 professors who are PhDs at major universities in the United States. And yet and still, we have to think consciously about the fact of where we place our IDs and then where we place another credential to let someone know that we're not a threat. So it transcends that. And the stat I always say is that African Americans are 3.5 times more likely to be killed by the police when they don't have a weapon, nor when they are attacking. That means that one group has a higher likelihood when they're not doing anything wrong versus another group, and that transcends social class. There's really not a difference in, say, an African American having a college degree or a professional job and their likelihood of being killed by the police and them not having that. It doesn't do anything. So when we talk about housing and criminal justice, if we really want to do something about changing things, I think those are 2 of the main social institutions that allow for those things to happen. And oftentimes think social organizations kind of allow for, oftentimes help us to kind of mitigate those particular social institutions.
Yeah, and I think from my perspective, thinking about the nonprofits, really the social institution that most affects nonprofits are their funding sources, and those are foundations. Foundations were built off of mostly white privileged wealth, and many of the people who serve on boards are not particularly diverse, nor do they come from the communities where some of the work that those foundations fund are being done. As a result, decisions are being made by people who don't understand what's going on in these communities, and that perpetuates these same systems of racism, unfortunately. It also means that some of the work that needs to be done around advocacy, around changing laws, around changing legislation isn't being done because foundations say, oh, well, that's a little risky. Let's not do that. Let's not put money there. Well, that's fundamentally where we have to put money if we want to start really addressing these root causes of systemic racism.
I mean, again, it's kind of sad to be third because they get all the good. No,
You can go next.
I'm kidding. No. You know, what emerges from what the two panelists just said is that our institutions are really quite outdated. And I think this is a real big problem. Institutions, again, are supposed to, every once in a while, look at their vision statement, their mission statement, and what they're supposed to be about, and then they're supposed to make sure that they carry out the reason for which that institution was created. Now, if you look at, again, institutions of government, politics, I mean, I can keep going on and on and on. Economics, again, et cetera, there is a huge gap between how they run their day-to-day business versus what their mission statement is about. And I think this is a huge problem. In other words, we are in almost the third decade of the 21st century, but we are really back in probably at the turn of the last century, our institutions, meaning, you know, when we went from the 1900s on, the turn of the century, meaning the 20th century versus the 21st. Anyhow, they are outdated. Now, what I'd like to say about the problems of structural racism and institutions is this, that I don't think we can talk about structural racism in this country unless we really try to understand slavery in this country. And I really mean that very sincerely, because I have had to work really hard to understand slavery in this country. By that I mean it is not a very pleasant thing to read about. It is not a very pleasant thing to spend time on, because the way slavery was done in this country, I have not seen a model quite like it anywhere else. And I'm being very candid because I know other models. I've studied this very carefully for my own purposes. If we don't understand slavery within the American context, we will not understand the America of today and the problem of race. So here's one example. Sociologists have done studies, and they've interviewed thousands upon thousands of both blacks and whites, Americans, okay? And let me just quote one of the sociologists, Joe Fegan, who says, "We have found that black Americans in all walks of life are usually very aware of and sensitive to the multifaceted reality of everyday racism for themselves and for their families and for other African Americans. They're very aware of this problem of racism. They are, on average, much more conscious of the reality and importance of the country's highly racialized past, both the recent past and the distant past, than are white Americans." So this survey that they did was really interesting. And I want to just tell you what they found, and I won't go much longer. When asked to think about the past in relation to the current problems of racism, many white Americans pushed the eras of slavery or segregation as far back into the distant past as they can. White Americans. White Americans expressed this attitude with statements like, "Slavery happened hundreds of years ago. My family never segregated any lunch counters." Or, "Blacks should get over it, forget the past, and move on." For black people, in contrast to whites, past history is directly linked to their day-to-day experiences with white-generated and white-maintained racism. Fegan says clearly significant collective remembering by blacks and significant collective forgetting by whites are both aspects of a highly racist U.S. society. You see, that really paints the picture, I think. That really is the problem right there. Look at the huge gap that exists between these two populations. And I would even add, based on the recent anti-Semitism and the increases in anti-Semitism that we're experiencing, that it also, this kind of attitude also relates to that kind of injustice and prejudice. Anti-Semitism just won't go away. And we need to ask, what is it about our society that doesn't have the consciousness yet to understand how to alleviate this problem? So for me, institutions have to really rethink how they are inclusive of all people in a society, how they should not discriminate against anyone or segregate against anyone. I think those are the real major issues that we have to deal with in terms of the institutions.
Thank you. I'd like to pose a question in particular to Dr. Boyarsky, but everyone feel free to jump in. How do structural barriers and culture interact to create oppressive conditions and perpetuate racial inequity?
Really good question, and this is something we saw a lot in the research that we did last year. What we found was that within nonprofit organizations, there really still is a white male-dominant work culture. And this is, as nonprofits became more professionalized, this became more pervasive. And what that means for reality of the people who work at that organization is there are biases on who gets chosen to even work there. You might look at 2 resumes and people may be equally qualified. However, there have been discussions at board meetings where boards say, well, they may just not fit the culture of our organization. So the word culture often is used as this way to excuse some of the innate biases that we have. But we also have positive biases, and this was something I learned recently in implicit bias training, was that sometimes when we look at resumes, we say, oh, well, they went to the same school I went to, or they were engaged in the same social network that I was. That's great. That means that, we have something in common. Well, when you are, a white person, that means you are often privileging certain networks where you see people who look just like you, and that makes it much harder to hire people who come from different backgrounds. And I think what we're really forgetting is that if we're working in communities of color, people who come from those communities are actually bringing something in addition to what you see on their resume. This is a whole understanding that is really critical for the work that we do, and we are not looking at that when we're looking at who we're hiring, in most cases in these organizations. So what I'm seeing is that, not only is it's this internal culture, but then also it's who is helping make these decisions, what networks are we working through to find people to work at in nonprofits, especially when you're looking at the executive level. A lot of nonprofits will hire an executive search firm who surprisingly is mostly made up of white people and white networks. And of course, then those are the resumes that you see, and those are the people that you end up choosing. And so how do we start to break down that connection between these structural barriers of these networks and also this culture of what does it mean to be a professional in our nonprofit sector?
Laid out some of the problems, some of the critical challenges at hand, and I want to pivot and talk a bit about the solutions that we might propose, right? Before we get to the questions from the audience. Dr. Mahmoudi, in seeking solutions to structural racism, how do we build coalitions across disparate groups who may have different interests and concerns? And more broadly, I'd like to hear from everyone about how we develop practices and create systems to resist structural racism, but in particular across disparate groups.
I think that's a very important question, and it's a very difficult thing to achieve. It means that we have to, it means we have to get out of our comfort zone. And it means we have to find ways to meet people that we usually don't meet. And now I don't think that's as hard as it used to be, because with technology and media and social media and all that, it's become much easier to find out what's going on in a given community where you live or in a given society. And there are many other groups that you come into contact with on social media. What is important is to reach out to those groups, to hear what other people have to say, to hear their perspective that's different than yours. Then it has to move into the direction of how to bring different groups with different ideas, maybe even totally opposite from you, to have conversations about how to find common ground. Again, I don't imply that this is easy work, because it's not, but it can be done if we take on a posture that is more about how to engage with others and really become good listeners. Really become good listeners, rather than here's my agenda and come hell or high water, we are going to promote this. It's a process, and as you know, process always takes time and it takes patience. And so if you can get different groups to come together, I would suggest the first thing to do is to sit down and listen to each other. See what the commonalities are. From those commonalities, develop some ideas and some principles that you all agree upon. And then, once you agree on a set of principles or ideas that you can move forward on in relation to how to eliminate, how to be the solution to structural racism, then you begin to promote those ideas. But without that unified cohesion between these groups that at first are not in agreement with one another, without that unity of thought, there can be no unity of action. So that becomes extremely important. It's a hard process, but it works. It needs patience, and it needs a lot of time.
I'm going to pose one more two-part question before we open up to the audience. And I'll address this to both Dr. Boyarsky and Dr. Ray. I'd love to hear your insights on how we can develop specific practices and create systems, right, to actively resist structural racism. And I'd love to hear about some of the practicalities of anti-racist work, what that entails on the ground. Perhaps you can provide some examples. So broadly, practices and systems that we can create, and more specifically, the practical anti-racist work on the ground, the logistics involved.
All right. So I'm figuring you'll probably talk about some of the organizational aspects. I want to, as it relates to the practicalities, I want to talk about kind of what we can do, right? Like what each of us in this room can leave with today to make a difference. I think there are three specific things. First, I think we can work on ourselves, which is essentially what Dr. Mahmoudi just mentioned. Part of this is we have to do a self-assessment. I think one of the ways to do this, and you mentioned this, is figuring out what our own biases are. I think implicit association tests are great. As a sociologist who specializes in social psychology and race and gender, I think this is a way to do these assessments. You can type in IAT and Harvard in your search engine on your phone or your laptop, and you can take some assessments about yourself to figure out where you stand. And if you get results and you're annoyed by them and you're upset or you think they're untrue, take them again. They'll probably be similar. But the point is that, but the point is that you then have to acknowledge something about yourself. So the first thing is to work on yourself. Number two, work on those who you love next. Work on those who you love next. Holidays are coming up. If you're like me, you have that bigoted uncle who said some of the racist and sexist things you've ever said, and you're like, I'm grown now, and this continues to be unchecked. You have to say something. And what you'll notice is that other family members will start to kind of chime in too, even if they're like, just be quiet, leave this person alone. But this is the key point there. If you can call out your racist uncle or your racist mama, then you can end up calling out anyone. So the most difficult call out ends up setting the tone for your life moving forward. And I have to do that on a regular basis. So, I mean, this isn't just, like sometimes people make the assumption in some kind of way simply because you do certain types of work that you don't have people who you love who have certain biases. All of us have biases. And so it's our job to speak up and speak out for them. Why is this important? Because you all sit at tables and I sit at tables that each of us will never sit at together. So when you're sitting at a table, I'm not there. None of us on this panel actually might be at some of those tables. If you don't speak up and speak out for us, who will do it then? And vice versa. Third thing is we then have to work to enable others through racial uplift activism, primarily by holding our local politicians accountable for equity, to implement procedural justice for policies to correct past wrongs. I think one way to do this, there's an app. It's called Countable. You can download it on your phone. You can put in your zip code. Some people know about this. It's great. It'll show you when your politicians are voting. You can instantly send them a letter. You can send a standard letter. You can send something specific. I do it all the time. Like, I'm just clicking on there. I'm like, I want to let them know what I think. Why should you do that? Because today, your vote, you're going to vote for somebody, and that's not where it stops. It's actually where it starts. Then you have to hold them accountable for the fact that you entrusted them with your vote. And we actually have to do some of those things. So I'll stop there, and then I look forward to the Q&A.
Awesome. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the specific practices within organizations and what they can do. The first is there really has to be an intentional commitment to diversifying the pipeline of people you're looking for positions. This starts as early as interns in your organization all the way up to board members. And sometimes this means really spending time to understand where are people who are not part of my network, who I can tap into. Sometimes it's going to, Black chambers of commerce to find out who's working in our community. Sometimes it's talking to other organizations that are led by people of color and say, who are your networks? How do we work with you? How can we find good people for the work that we're doing? Linked to that is making sure there's equity in salaries. There's so many nonprofits who are paying at way below what is required to just sort of live, especially in an area like the DMV. So thinking about and benchmarking where are salaries compared to other organizations and realizing that in some cases, people of color do require just as much, if not more, to support their families because of where they live, because of the systems that the racially biased systems that affect them. Secondly, is really focusing on professional development. So once you get people in your organization, how are you investing in them and their leadership development so you're helping them become the next set of leaders in our sector? And when we did our research, we heard from nonprofits, well, everyone gets equal opportunity for on-the-job training. Pretty much everyone gets equal opportunity to go to workshops. But then when we asked, well, what about mentoring? What about introducing them to your networks? That's where things started to fall apart, right? So it's when it starts to become much more of a relationship-based, professional development opportunity, we are not being as intentional as we can be about investing in all of our staff, particularly our staff of color. And I think the last piece, and this is something that the foundation community is really starting to work on, is getting them to understand that where their money goes makes a difference. And if they really want to talk about making changes and promoting racial justice, that means investing in advocacy. That means investing in, legislative fights. Right now, there's a funders group that is working on this 2020 census, and they are funding activism around the lawsuits that are being taken in relationship with the citizenship question. How do we get foundations to continue that work and see how that work is critical in really creating systems change?
Thank you to you all. And now we're going to pivot toward questions from the audience. I'm glancing at the questions now and sort of organizing them into groups. I'll pair these two together. Quite poignant questions. How does being quote unquote colorblind help or hinder the effort to address structural racism? And along with that, how do we start to talk about structural racism to people who deny that it still exists, many of whom may identify themselves as colorblind? So colorblind.
Go ahead.
Well, colorblind, it's such a weird term. It has a meaning, of course, but it doesn't apply to human beings because we're all different. The diversity, the differences that we're made of is actually what makes us so interesting, I think. We may not all agree on things, we may not all view certain things the same, but we have to see who the other person is. We have to acknowledge who this other human being is, with all of the identities that they might come with, whether it's their religion, their ethnicity, their race. I mean, even race I have a hard time with because there is no such thing, but you know, maybe skin color, the range of skin color, I don't know. But this idea that I don't see race, that I'm colorblind, imagine if you were the person who had to go through the day trying to, as I mentioned with the driver's licenses and all of that, who doesn't know, when they might be pulled over, or who tell me that they can't always get gasoline at certain gas stations because it may not be a friendly place. You know, imagine if you were that person and you told them, well, I'm colorblind and there's no racial problem if people could just be colorblind. If that were the case, we would have solved this problem centuries ago, quite frankly. So I think that term is really not very helpful because it, in a sense, actually denies the very problem that we are living with.
Yeah, I think for me, the challenge is that if you say you're colorblind, you're really focusing on equality and not equity. And Dr. Ray, I'm sure, will give us a little bit more on that. But I think the biggest problem is it's not we're trying to level the playing field, it's we're trying to reorganize the playing field, because right now it is completely unlevel, and if the assumption is color blindness, then it assumes that we're all starting at the same place, and we're just not. And so if we're not willing to start to invest in, as I said, pipelines of people, developing leadership, that has to be done intentionally with an understanding that we have completely created a system that is unequal, and that equity is going to require more than just saying, well, we're looking at all of these resumes as a colorblind way. So this is, I think, it really goes down to the equality and equity difference.
Yes, ditto. I mean, I think real quick, when people think about colorblindness, and I think about this a lot, the first thing is that I think part of it is unlayering part of the credit. So on one part, they do acknowledge that beneath the skin, that we're basically all the same. I mean, we're like 99.97% the same. Like, there is no gene for race. They haven't found it. Believe me, if it was one, they would have found it by now, as much as they try to act like it matters so much, right? So part of it is colorblind people do acknowledge that. But it's also a way for them to say, I'm not racist. I'm colorblind. I'm not racist. What they fail to realize is what the other two panelists just said. They fail to recognize that simply because racism is not real in its circumstances, or race isn't real in its circumstances, meaning where it comes from, beneath the skin, it is very real in its consequences. And if we don't acknowledge the consequences, then we can't move forward. What that means is I think we have to shift colorblind rhetoric to color-brave rhetoric. In order to deal with something, you have to take it head on. You can't act like it doesn't exist. Because in a lot of our worlds, it exists every single day. So by not acknowledging it, you're actually discounting our experience that we know matters. So part of what that means is being color brave. And I think we're laying out a lot of ways that organizations and people can be color brave. But I'll kind of leave it there. I think we have to make that shift.
It's 11:50, so I just want to give the students out if they need to. But I hope that you all, as many of you as possible, will be able to stick around. We have another 25 minutes, so we have lots of conversation ahead.
Okay, we can get back going. They're chatty. They like to talk, so they'll keep talking if you let them.
Okay, so we have a number of questions ahead. I'm going to pair these two, which both concern the ways that college students in particular can intervene. The first question reads, aside from voting, how can we as college students have a meaningful impact on reducing and perhaps ending structural racism, in particular in the housing market and criminal justice system? And the other question, again, concerning college students in particular, is how do we as college students work to reduce the effects of structural racism that we see on campus itself? We're thinking about the housing market, we're thinking about the criminal justice system, and racism, structural racism that manifests on campus. How can college students work to positively intervene?
I mean, obviously, what we've seen on our campus over the past, not just week and a half, which I think for most of us has been a whirlwind in various ways, but even over the past 2 to 3 years, I mean, there have been a series of incidents, and what I would encourage people to do is the Critical Race Initiative, who helped co-sponsor this. Graduate students in the Critical Race Initiative actually just penned an op-ed that's in the Diamondback today. You can go and check it out. It's phenomenal in terms of kind of laying out some of the things that students can do. So the first thing I would say is to build coalitions. One of the things that happens on our campus, yes, University of Maryland is very diverse. It's the most diverse, racially diverse university I've ever been on by far. Right, by far. I mean, more than Indiana, Michigan, Berkeley. I mean, all these places that they kind of hail as being super diverse doesn't even come close to Maryland. Part of that, though, means that we then have a different challenge. That challenge is that we can get very comfortable in seeing diversity, but not actually experiencing it. What I mean by that is we see diverse others every single day. It doesn't mean you talk to them. It doesn't mean you're friends with them. It doesn't mean you actually consult with them. So there are a lot of different organizations on campus that never interact with one another. And I think what we have to start doing is doing real coalition building. So what I would encourage students to do first is whatever organization you're in, it's what Dr. Mahmoudi said, is to start to have events collectively. These could be dinners. And a matter of fact, President Lowe has already started doing some of these. But it's to get organizations together and have conversations with each other and listen. I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing that we can actually do as it relates to housing and criminal justice on and off campus is to continue to raise awareness. I think one of the things that we don't do enough of today that, because again, we have to acknowledge formally that we are in the middle of a social movement. Like the 1950s and 60s was the last one. This is it. We're living through it. This is happening now. It's so many ebbs and flows. One thing that's missing that used to happen in the 50s and 60s are teach-ins. Like I consider events like this kind of teach-ins, right? But they can be even more specific. So what I would encourage students to do are to hold teach-ins on a particular topic. The first thing we have to do, which is what we heard about education, always think about Martin Luther King Jr.'s 4-step process for nonviolent action. The first step in that process is a collection of facts. In order to deal with colorblindness or whatever else we want to talk about, part of the issue is that people are on different pages in the same book. Sometimes they're not even in the same book. We have to get in the same book and we have to get on the same page. And part of that means we can have teach-ins to figure out what we need to do. Then, as we also heard, these different coalitions of students can figure out what is our common ground. Based on that common ground, then we can say these are the 2 or 3 things that we want to tackle first. Because there's 20 different things that we could do, to tell you the truth. I mean, there's so many problems. But you start with the few that we can agree upon and then continue to build relationships over time that matter. And I think the coalition building, I think having teach-ins, I think coming together the way students did last week, that was marvelous. Like Dr. Stephen Thomas, who's in the back, he helped represent faculty at the administration building. There were about 300 students there. Faculty and staff were also there watching. The thing that I have to acknowledge as I get older is that in many respects, time has passed me by and time has passed us by to dream for what the future really looks like, for what change really looks like. It's a reason why people who are in their late teens and early 20s start movements, finish movements, and make change. It's a reason for that. So a lot of the things that we're talking about might not even be enough for you all. You have to be willing to push the boundaries and push us to do the things we need to do for you to be the change that you think needs to happen.
Just an observation. I mean, students are really important as teachers. You know, I teach a seminar on the problem of prejudice, and no one is a teacher in there. All of us are. In other words, we read the materials, we come to class, and what we do is we talk about what our views and perspectives are. And all of us learn in that environment. And I don't want to repeat what Dr. Ray has already said, but you know, students need to, I keep saying get out of the comfort zone. In some ways, you need to talk to people who you usually don't talk to. And that's hard, I know, but there are many people who are just afraid or shy, and if someone could just reach out to them, they really would welcome that opportunity to learn from you. So I would say students who are experiencing certain discrimination or prejudice, or they feel excluded, whatever it might be, and especially in the area of structural racism, I think students need to educate students. And so anything that they can do, I love the idea of the dinners that Dr. Ray spoke about, a social gathering where there's something more to it. You do come together, you break bread together, but then you discuss some of the problems, the issues that you are facing right on this campus, you know, and then it isn't, and it shouldn't always be to get someone to do something. Do you know what I mean? You can't, the president of the university can just do so much. I'm not saying that they should be, you know, put off the hook. That's not what I'm saying here. But there are many things that the grassroots can do that will truly change the culture of an institution. And so students, I think, are the most powerful in relation to bringing those kinds of changes about. But it has to be positive, it has to be inviting, and it has to be a welcoming environment where some people who are frankly afraid can come and learn within that environment.
All right, can I just make Dr. Mahmoudi made me think of two specific things students can do. First thing, at other universities that I've been on, and the person who's really led this has been Creston Lynch. He's now at George Mason. He'll be a great person to bring here to talk about this. One of the things he's done at all the universities he's been at, Clemson, Southern Methodist, place in Alabama, Western Kentucky, is he started a policy where every organization had to co-sponsor at least 2 programs a year with organizations that essentially look completely different than them. And we could come up with different ways in which they might be. So for Greeks, they might be doing an event with non-Greeks. Or it might be a predominantly white fraternity or sorority doing something with a predominantly organization or historically serving organization, fraternity or sorority. Part of what this does is that it further builds coalitions with people. So that's kind of one thing that could be done, one particular policy. The other thing is that here at the University of Maryland, we don't have a set course or even a set curriculum for dealing with diversity and bias. Students could push, and the task force that I happened to be on last year on Unity and Respect that came out of the death of Army Lieutenant Richard Collins, we were pushing for a course or some type of curriculum that all students go through to get the same amount of information. That isn't happening here. So for students, you all can push these things. I mean, we had Protect UMD that came up with like 90 different suggestions. You all can continue to push these things. I think on a policy front, that's one of the things you could do. And I would say for students who don't think that, you know, being involved with student government or student activities matters, I think they actually do. And I think if you're not sitting at the table, you're on the menu and somebody's eating you for lunch. And I feel like politicians where I say if they don't give you a seat at the table, bring your folding chair and make sure that you sit there and listen and have some input.
Wonderful. How do we address racial privilege, the racial privilege of white people who insist that they've had hard lives?
That's a tough one. I went to a training on racial equity, and it was only for white people. And it was so white people could have their time to air their own issues and their own questions and their own, you know, feeling uncomfortable talking about race. And I think some of those things came up. And I think the one thing is, you know, I really think the question is who is we, but the one thing I keep hearing is whites cannot ask people of color to help them through this. People of color have already, you know, they're the ones who had to go through this already. They were the ones who suffered through our, you know, structural biases for generations. White people have to figure out how to have their own space to get over some of these, you know, feeling uncomfortable, not knowing, still thinking that there's some, you know, some commonalities. I think once that's done, then creating what we've talked about is safe space to say, you know, I hear what you're saying. I know my experience is not the same. However, you know, I can understand because of whatever. I think we don't discount anyone's history, but you know, when I've talked to nonprofit leaders who are trying to work on racial equity work, particularly those of color, they just say this is emotionally exhausting and expensive for us. We have to deal with this, and then we have to make our white colleagues feel okay. That's too much. And so I think it's a really important question, but I think, you know, as privileged white people, we need to find spaces where we have those discussions so we're not burdening others with the process that we as individuals need to go through. I've heard from leaders of nonprofits who said, I can't lead this in my organization until I've gone through this personally so that I have figured out how I can understand my role in this whole process. So it's not the easiest solution, but I do think that we need to be very careful about who we're burdening with these biases that we have.
I'll just say quickly, when I think about this, I think that, I guess specifically talking to whites who might make this comment, you may have had a hard life, and I'm pretty sure that you probably have, but race isn't the reason why. And I think that is the fundamental difference. And part of realizing that is to recognize and acknowledge that race and racism in particular is a pillar that built America. When we started this conversation talking about structural racism, one of the other ways I think about structural racism is like a house. Like you see the house, it looks all pretty and nice. What you don't see is what's underneath the house, the foundation that holds it up. It's kind of like a tree in its roots. As tall as the trees are we see outside, they are about 3 times as deep and strong in the ground as they are above ground. That's what we don't see. Those pillars that hold up the house of the United States, one of those major pillars is racism. And we have to acknowledge that. And I think it's a quote that President Lyndon Johnson said that I always think about when I hear this particular question. He said, I tell you what's at the bottom of it. If you can convince the lowest white man he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice you're picking his pocket. He'll give you, give him somebody to look down on, and he'll empty his pockets for you. So when I think about what's happening in America and how we continue to have this kind of Southern strategy that's continued to being implemented throughout the South, and I'm from Tennessee, by the way, so I think about this in a more nuanced way than most people. What we have to do is, like, when I ride through certain parts of the South, even certain parts of Maryland, because Maryland's still South, and I mean, I see white poverty. It's there. But for black folks and Latinos, it happened 2 decades before, because the work disappeared there 2 decades before it disappeared here. And instead, what we have to do is build coalitions among minorities and low-income whites. But see, the system is set up to make us compete against each other instead of realizing that we actually have the same goals.
Quickly, I do think it's a matter of who has been, it isn't who has more pain than someone else. And as Dr. Ray said, the difference is that race is an issue in relation to this question. And I think one of the most important things is that we have to, in a sense, those of us who are whites have to take responsibility for what has happened in this country in relation to slavery and in relation to everything else that came out of that history, which still is with us. Without taking ownership of that, it really isn't possible to try to eliminate the problem, I don't think.
I have another question here. What are your thoughts about the possibility and feasibility of reparations to address structural racism. Wes.
I knew it was coming. I was waiting on it. I got notes on it. So I'll just say quickly, this is how I think about reparations. Every other group who has been disenfranchised primarily by race or skin color have received reparations except for black people in the United States. Every other group. Native Americans, for the forced removal off their land, received reparations when they headed west after they got there. Now we could talk about the fact that that land that they got wasn't as great as it should have been. The land didn't perk. We could talk about those details if you're interested. But they got quite a bit of money when they moved west. Japanese Americans for internment during World War II got reparations. Was it 4 decades later? It was, but they got it. Jewish Americans, Jewish Europeans got reparations from the Holocaust. It's one of the reasons as to why they were able to move to different countries and essentially start over. It wasn't just about starting over, it was also about having a large chunk of money that was federally funded to do that. Black people were promised 40 acres and a mule. Never got it. Where did the 40 acres and a mule come from? Well, when originally, early 1600s, when Africans and Europeans were brought to the United States, they were indentured servants. They were supposed to serve 7 years, and then they were supposed to be given their freedom. Well, they started realizing how profitable it was to have free labor. Duh, free labor is one of the things that built the United States, hence why racism is a pillar. So part of thinking about that is the fact that whites got their indentured servitude and got their freedom, and they essentially got that 40 acres and a mule. That's where it comes from. And then when slavery ended, black people were supposed to get that. And then politicians were like, wait, hold on, hold on. We about to give 40 acres and a mule to the only people who know how to actually farm? I don't think we should do that, right? So during Reconstruction, that was one of the things that got pulled back. Then black people got screwed again during World War II with the New Deal, because you had blacks and whites fighting in World War II together. They didn't get GI Bill money when they came back. This is part of the reason why HBCUs are created today. It's actually amazing how many HBCUs sustain themselves, because they were not built to sustain themselves like that. They were just simply built to allow black World War II veterans be able to go to school, because they couldn't come to places like University of Maryland. Hence the reason why Perrin Mitchell couldn't come here. Hence the reason why we don't have a Supreme Court justice, because Thurgood Marshall had to go to Howard instead of here. And hence the reason now why Byrd Stadium right behind us doesn't have that name on it anymore. It's because of racism in our particular area, where Maryland was one of the largest states dealing with crops and dealing with slaves. Then let's just fast forward even more, because it's part of a continuum. Then now you have police killings basically at an all-time high, and now you have people in those local communities paying taxpayer money for civil payouts for those people in their own community getting killed. It's a continuum. You can't separate it. So part of when we talk about reparations, one of the arguments people make is, oh, well, it's too far, it's been too long, or we don't exactly know who to give it to. That's bullcrap. Because when we look at reparations throughout in history, reparations were rarely given immediately. They took decades to happen. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that people need individual payouts, even though I think we could have that conversation. But based on the way that segregation operates in our society, there could be resources allocated for certain communities that start to transform those communities. And we have examples of this, like the Harlem Children's Zone in New York. That was basically money that was dumped from organizations and other sorts of things. They've literally changed that community in Harlem. That could be done all around the country. If people want to do something about the South Side of Chicago, dump money into it. Give people equitable education. Give people jobs. If you actually want to do something about crime in Chicago. But see, the problem is, it has to go back to the question that if racism was an original pillar of the United States, a lot of people are invested in that pillar still being there. Hence the reason why black people haven't gotten reparations. And we just have to acknowledge which groups have received it and which groups haven't. Y'all got me riled up today. I think on election day.
I just want to say a few words. I think this goes back to what I said earlier, that institutions and structures should be about justice and equity. And I think this ties right into that, which is that here's a group that has been denied all kinds of things for which laws were passed. You know, we're not talking about just, here's my wish list, right? There were laws that were passed that entitled this population to have certain things. And continually, they've been denied. So I don't see anything wrong with a system which goes ahead and considers reparations in this regard.
I'm going to close with one more question because we're running out of time. This will be quite a broad question. Listening to the panelists, it feels like we need a social revolution. The question is framed this way: do we need a civil rights movement like we had in the 1960s? But more broadly, I want you to talk about the social revolution that is taking place. And I'm curious to hear your wish list for the outcome of the revolution we're amid right now.
So I run a coalition of grassroots organizations in Northern Virginia. And to be honest, it is a very white group of mostly middle-class women. And we're working to elect more progressives to office. And I think in order for really there to be a social movement, as we've said multiple times on this panel, we need to start finding ways to bridge between different grassroots movements and organizations. I think the challenge that I'm seeing is a lot of us can agree that we want progressives elected, but then once you get to the legislation pieces, that's where things get very sticky and complicated, because if you think about women's health issues, women's health is one thing for one set of women and another thing for another set of women. And that's whether it's a division between races, but sometimes it's within your own racial category as well. And we have to find ways to start to get back to where we used to be, where compromise was something that was considered a good thing, right? It was a good thing to be able to figure out, where do we have commonalities? What can we work on together? But with the coalition that we have been working on, people said, wow, we're so surprised you guys, there's no infighting yet. And I said, well, that's because we haven't gotten to any of the, these legislative battles. But how do we find some key areas where there is commonality? How do we find some key places that we can come together and say, this is something we really care about? I think, as I think Dr. Ray mentioned right at the beginning of this, one of those areas is gerrymandering. I think that's an issue that affects everyone. It affects everyone in a way that it's making sure that you are not represented by your vote. I was just watching a clip from a show last night that basically showed some research that said, if the Democrats in a normal, ungerrymandered state, I think we're +2 on the ballot today, they would pick up something like 19 seats in the House. But because of gerrymandering, they will pick up 5. 19 and 5. I mean, that's insane. And so I think that is a very, very key issue where we could think about getting together a broad coalition. And the one thing I love about the grassroots is they aren't part of these structural systems that already exist. You can think about Black Lives Matter as being part of the grassroots. You can think about, the current women's movement as being part of the grassroots. They are not part of the system. They are working with outside the system, trying to put pressure on the system to change. And so I think that is a space where if we organize well and effectively, we can make a difference.
I'm sorry, this is a huge question. It really is. My gut reaction is to say all of our institutions need to change from the very roots of those institutions, including the political system, including the partisan politics. I do, because I think it's become the culture of hate and violence that is perpetuated by our political system is very troubling to me. I really find it very, very disturbing. And I don't have answers as much as I have questions. How do you change a system that is so deeply ingrained in this culture? Where do we begin, to consider, will we always have 2 parties at each other's throat? Should there be maybe a few more? I don't know. I'm really not presenting solutions much more than I am the dilemma of the existing structures that have locked us in, so to speak, and which promote things that are not good for any of us. Yes, it would be nice to have some kind of a civil rights movement of sorts where nonviolently you raise consciousness, you raise awareness, and you hold institutions accountable. But I see such a division between, in terms of, I don't know how else to put it, the haves and the have-nots, the power struggle that's going on right now between a group of people who basically are comfortable where they are and don't want to change a thing, in fact want to dig in and preserve and maintain the existing system. And then you have a group of people who are really having a hard time in their daily lives, in their putting, bread on the table, and just don't have the power to make change. So, this is really a spiritual problem, and I can talk to you about it, I can give you my personal opinions, but I just don't have easy answers. It's extremely complex.
Yeah, I mean, great question, Dr. Bruce. I mean, what does racial equity look like? Part of this is in Prince George's County, and we had an event a couple weeks ago where we brought together 20 nonprofit leaders and 20 community leaders, and it was sponsored by the Washington Regional Area Grantmakers Association, and it was great. And there were a few people here who attended that event. And I think events like that are the sort of things that have to move on. The work that Tonya Wellens in the county is doing is the type of work that's going to progress us. And so when I think about what does racial equity look like, for me, it really goes from structural to personal really quickly. Like, I'm able to really kind of extrapolate and think on a structural level, but what racial equity looks like in the future pushes me to do something different. And when I think about it, it's really where my boys can live free like their white friends. And by free, I mean mentally, emotionally, physically, where they don't have to police their physical movements, where they don't have to police their words, and really where they can dream. Where they can dream to be joyous, where all of a sudden they hit 10 or 12, and instantly society, based on the way race operates, puts limits on where they think they can go and what they think they can do. So I think what we deal with structurally really comes down to what's happening personally. It's where their parents don't worry about them playing outside with toy guns because someone might interpret them as having something different, which are the kind of conversations that my wife have in our house. So yes, I think we're in the middle of a social revolution. And I think we're gonna kind of, or at least I'm gonna kind of start where we started, which is with students. I think students are our future. And so what I'm asking you to do as a person who's starting to become like an old fogey to you all is to help make the world a better place for my boys and their friends. And that's something that, because of how society has already structured us, we're kind of unable to do. We have limitations on what we see, but you all don't. Don't ever lose that. And keep pushing so that my boys and their friends in 15 years can do the same thing for the next generation.
Thank you. And on that note, please join me in thanking Dr. Mahmoudi, Dr. Boyarsky, and Dr. Ray for a phenomenal conversation.
I will just say a few closing remarks. I want to also thank the panelists, and especially Dr. Lamar Jarrell Bruce, who did a beautiful, magnificent job as a moderator. Thank you. Lastly, I just want to tell you that Dr. Ray and I had similar conversations about Be the Solution in terms of interrogating structural racism. So please follow us on social media and join us when we hold these, hopefully on both semesters, fall and spring, so that we continue this process and conversation. Thank you very much for being here.